Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be working through Chapter 3 of the MAAF119 exam. As usual, let's skip ahead to the requirements of the question. So number A is we have to develop and justify 4 non-financial KPIs which will enable them to achieve their goals. So it's 8 marks, that means 1 mark, so we need to list 4 things and then provide an explanation for 4 of them, or justify I should say. So it's 2 mark per thing. Then we need to identify 6 weaknesses or threats that they face for 6 marks. So it's 1 mark each. And then for the part C, we need to identify 1 strategy that they're pursuing under Porter's generic strategies. Number 2, advise the CEO of 2 different generic strategy options that they could pursue. And number 3, justify your advice for each of those 2 points. Okay, so let's just quickly read through the background information. So NG, Nick Group, is a grower of vegetables. Their profit is generated from 4 major customers, which are supermarkets, and their margins are under pressure by those customers. This combined with downward pressure on prices from freight costs are depressing their profit margins. So water is a key input as they're vegetable growers. The availability of water is a big concern, and the CEO has admitted recently that they've made little progress in developing water recycling initiatives. Wastage, because they're fruit and vegetable growers, they have a standard wastage factor, which is 8% for NG. Industry growth, so it's so over time the industries benefit from higher disposable income from free trade agreements, and the shift of consumer preferences towards eating out has actually boosted wholesale demand for fruit and vegetables. Okay, so here are NG's goals, which we will be linking into our KPIs over here. Because a KPI at the end of the day is how you're actually going to achieve and measure that you're achieving your goal. So their goals are to achieve greater yield and better quality of produce and using fewer inputs and reducing environmental impact. So to achieve those goals, they're going to do these things. And this is basically what we're going to measure with KPIs, because you want to measure whether or not they're achieving their goal. So these are the things here that we would need to test for a KPI. Okay, so number 1, using fertilizer to enhance crop growth where practical, use organic. So they focus on using organic and biological crop nutritional inputs. Number 2 is eliminating the migration of applied pesticides beyond farm boundaries. Number 3 is increasing its use of nutrients that are derived from alternative products such as organic manures and plant residues. Currently they use non-organic. And number 4, reducing water inputs. So before we begin in actually identifying our KPIs, let's just quickly look at our notes from MAAF. The most important thing when developing KPIs is the SMART rule. So they need to be specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. So if you don't actually incorporate these into your answer, you won't actually get a mark for it, even if you've identified the right thing. So you need to be very careful in your wording, because a couple of words can mean the difference between getting a mark and not getting a mark. So we just need to make sure we're satisfying those. So if we just go through these one by one and come up with a worded KPI that we could use and then provide a justification. So number 1, if we focus on the use of crop nutritional elements, so fertilizer, so the use of organic fertilizer, they want to increase their uptake. So we need to figure out a way of actually putting a target which can be measured, which is actionable, specific, and so forth. So if they want to increase their percentage of organic fertilizer as a percentage of their total, one measure we could use is also percentage, right? Because they're using a percentage. So we want to measure the percentage of nutrients that are organic as a percentage of the total measured within 1 year. Okay, so let's just go back to our SMART, make sure that we've actually ticked off all of these. So specifics, we haven't used something very generic. Our response is quite specific. it's measurable. Okay, so a percentage is a measurable figure. So we can always measure a percentage. Action-oriented. That it's meant to inspire an action or behavior, so that's what's inspiring the measurement. And the uptake of organic fertilizer needs to be realistic as well. So that's definitely achievable here. And time bound. So we said within 1 year. So because we've added that time period, we're going to get the full marks. But if we had missed any of those steps, if we had given an answer that was too generic, didn't actually give a measure that you could, like a number or a percentage or a fraction or something like that, then, and you haven't given something that's realistic or linked to the action in the question or time, you're not going to get the full mark for that. So that's going to be 1 mark for identifying it. But of course the question is justify as well. So we need to provide justification that this will enable them to measure whether it's achieved its goals. So this KPI is actually going to allow them to measure. So these are their goals up here. We need to link it to one of these two. This is going to help them achieve the reduced environmental impact goal because they're using organic inputs, which are going to be better for the environment than artificial inputs. So that's basically 2 marks right there. So moving on to the next one, which is to eliminate or reduce the migration of applied pesticides. So for the first one, we used a percentage. Do you think we can use a percentage for this one? Like, for example, percentage of soil that has an applied pesticide on it. Well, again, going back to this smart measurement over here, this wouldn't be realistic. It's definitely specific and measurable and action-oriented, but it's not realistic because that would require you to go out and measure all of your soil and see if there's pesticide on it. Also, you haven't put a time on it. So that wouldn't satisfy realistic. So another way we could do it is potentially just saying the number of instances. So the number of times, let's go back to the question, the number of times that we've identified that there is a migration of applied pesticide across farm boundaries, so linking into the question, within 1 year. So notice how I'm always saying a time period in the questions, just so it's measurable within a time period. Okay, so that's 1 mark there, which would satisfy that one. Then linking it into one of these goals up here above. So is it achieving a greater yield, better quality, or is it using fewer inputs and reducing environmental? Well, what we can say is this links to the goal of eliminating or reducing the migration of applied pesticide beyond farm boundaries, which is going to result in better quality produce and it reduces the environmental impact. Okay, so for the third one, increase in its use of nutrients that are derived from alternative products, such as organic manures and plant residues. So what we could say here is, so is it going to be number, percentage? So this is something that we could venture as a percentage. It's a percentage of nutrients that are organic. So that's reasonable. So we could say percentage of nutrients that are organic at the farm within a 1 year period. Something like that. That would satisfy all of the smart. And then linking this to the goals. So which one do you think it's going to be? Is it yield, quality, fewer inputs, or reducing environmental impact? Well, the use of organic materials, similar to the first point up here, is going to reduce the environmental impact. So that's how we're going to justify this KPI. Okay, let's move on to reducing water inputs. So, particularly through efficient water use. So they mentioned before recycled water. They've got it here too. Ensure the availability of water with a particular focus on water recycling. So this is something where you could measure the percentage of water that is actually recycled. So you could use the percentage of water that's recycled, or you could say the number, so the number of non-recycled water per ton of output. So those are two options you could use. And then linking it to the question, so these will measure whether there's reduced environmental impact. Okay. You could also measure it to link it to this one here, which is using fewer inputs. So that's how you answer part A. We've identified 4 things, and we've given 4 justifications. Okay, so let's move on to part B, which is to describe 6 weaknesses or threats that NG face. Okay, so we have to identify how many risks? 6 risks, 1 mark each. Now, if you need some inspiration in your exam, you can always refer back to the business risk section in your notes, which gives you some prompts. It's not going to give you the exact risks that you need, but it's going to give you some ideas. So, for example, financial risk, strategic, operational, compliance, reputation, environmental, disaster. And then there's some more specific examples in these notes, for example, competitors, financial innovation, etc. However, in MAAF, generally, it's not something you can really follow a template for. You really just have to understand what's in the content and come to the conclusion yourself. So if we go back to the core content in the question. Question 3. Okay, so let's just read through the text again and let's identify the key risks from the text as we see it. Okay, so first of all, profitability. So it looks like recently the supermarkets have been started to bypass NG's wholesale operation by purchasing directly from other growers. So this is a big risk because it potentially is a financial risk which may lose potential future sales. That's one main risk right there. Another main risk in this section is the fact that 96% of its revenue is made from 4 supermarkets. So they've got a heavy reliance on these 4 companies. It's effectively an oligopoly. And therefore a lot of influential power is sitting with its customer base. Okay. Let's have a look at water. So for water, the availability of water has been a major concern. So the chief executive has recently admitted that they've made little progress in developing water recycling initiatives. So the key risk here is that the water recycling initiatives may actually not be effective. The fact that they've admitted that in public is evidence of that. Okay, so another key risk in this section is the fact that they may actually not have enough input water in future, given it's a key input, and they've mentioned it as a significant risk previously. So there's 2 separate risks in there that we could use. Okay, so what about wastage? Is there anything in there? So there's nothing that really suggests that their wastage has changed or might be at risk. So we'll just move on from there. Okay, so industry growth. So there's they've benefited from increasing household disposable income, so nothing of particular risk there. So free trade agreements hasn't really changed anything there, but there is a potential risk here as consumer preferences shift towards convenience and dining out experiences. So potentially they may lose sales through this. So whilst there's demand for wholesale fruit, they may lose their supermarket sales as a result of that. Okay, so if we just summarize, we need 6 threats. We've mentioned quite a few. So if we're going to pick the best ones out of there, so number 1, I'd probably choose concentration of customers. There's 1. Number 2 is supermarkets bypassing and purchasing from other growers. 2. Number 3 is maybe increasing freight across. That's 3. Number 4 might be the actual supply of water, the accessibility of water. That's 4. Number 5 could be the potential loss of customers due to a shift in consumer preferences toward wholesale fruit. And then potentially the fact that there is that their water recycling initiatives aren't working. So there's the 6 there. That should get a full 6 marks for Part B. For Part C, we have to identify one strategy that NG is currently pursuing based on Porter's generic strategies. So Porter's generic strategies can be found in the notes in Chapter 1, Management Strategy, around row 720. So we've got 5 different kinds of Porter's generic strategies. So number 1, broad low-cost provider, broad differentiation provider, best cost provider, focus strategy based on low cost, focus strategy based on differentiation. So these can generally be summarized in this 2x2 down here, which is between target market and competitive advantage. So if your target market is every consumer, you're more likely to be in the top half, so broad. And if it's a narrow niche of segment, it's probably going to be the focused. Now, your competitive advantage, you can either be a low-cost strategy or you can be based on differentiation. So, for example, you might have someone like Lexus, which is differentiated based on high quality, or you could have someone like Tesco or Coles, which is just about getting the lowest cost item out to consumers. Now, the best cost provider strategy fits right in the middle of there. So these are the 5 strategies here. Each of these can be summarized in that 2x2 before. So if you think about the company in the question, so NG, they're trying to get as many sales as possible, and they're competing with a lot of other groups for cost. So they're definitely not a niche market. They're going to be a broad provider. So they're either going to be a provider, they're either going to be a broad low cost provider or a best cost provider. The most applicable one is probably a broad low cost provider, because they're selling to a wide spectrum by achieving a lower cost structure than its rivals. So you're going to get 2 marks for that. 1 for identifying the strategy, so broad low cost, and number 2 for justifying it. So we linked it to the question and said, well, they're trying to target a large target market, which is consumers through supermarkets and anyone else who wants to buy it, and they're trying to achieve the lowest cost price. They're not trying to differentiate in any other kind of way, such as through the product, etc. So then the next part is we have to actually advise the CEO of 2 different generic strategy options that NG could pursue. So if we go back to our notes and look at the potential options, so we can differentiate based on the size of the market that we're looking at, or the product itself, or the cost that we're offering. So currently we're looking at broad low cost, but what we could do is potentially differentiate the product itself. So we could focus on a broad differentiation strategy, which is the second point on the screen. So you could focus on something like organic products or healthy products, or products that only use environmentally friendly inputs. So that's one potential one. Another one is focusing on a niche market. So currently we're targeting a broad market. We could focus on a niche market. So remember in the question, they specifically mentioned the free trade agreements in those Asian countries. As I always say, the CA doesn't give random pieces of information. Whenever they use something in the context, we should try and use it. So that's why I'm thinking of using the free trade agreement and saying, let's actually focus on building an export market, which is a focused demographic that we're actually selling to, and linking it back to the text. So those are the 2 strategies that we're actually going to pursue and recommend to the CEO from Porter's generic strategies. And then another 2 marks for actually justifying that, which I think we've done there. So that's how you get a full 20 out of 20 for question 3. Let's move on to question 4 in the next video.